Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something you see in the headlines all the time, but maybe don't get the full picture on. The really complex world of toppling tyrants.
Yeah, it's tricky stuff.
Absolutely. We've gathered a whole stack of sources, and we're going to try and unpack the strategies, the unexpected challenges, and some really deep ethical questions that come up.
It's definitely not straightforward.
And our sources really hammer this home. Look, few things in politics are harder than getting rid of a dictator. But, and this is key, it doesn't mean it's always doomed to fail.
Right.
So our mission, really, for you listening, is to figure out what kind of influence outsiders realistically have. And what does it actually take to break that dictatorial cycle, without making things even worse.
And it's crucial to remember right from the start that outside influence, well, it often has its limits. A lot of the time, maybe most of the time, the real heavy lifting falls on the people inside the country.
Especially certain people.
Exactly. It often comes down to those closest to the center of power. The general rule seems to be, the closer you are physically or politically to the tyrant thing, the defense minister versus, say, a shopkeeper, the more potential influence you wield.
Okay, so how do outsiders even try? Our sources seem to point to two main paths, two ways they try to break the cycle. There's this slower, maybe more subtle approach, kind of chipping away at the base of the tyrant's power over time.
The long game.
Yeah, the long game. And then there's the more direct route, the one aiming to, take out the tyrant directly, much faster, much riskier.
And of course, not every country has the same playbook or the same tools. Some, like the U.S., have a huge range, right? Political pressure, economic stuff, even military force.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about the U.S. recognizing Guaido in Venezuela. Or way back, President Carter blocking IMF credit to Nicaragua, cutting off military aid to Somoza. Or Kennedy sending the fleet off the Dominican coast, which basically pushed Trujillo's son out. And then you have the really direct stuff. Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011.
Big interventions.
Big ones. But other countries might have more specialized leverage. Maybe their banks are where the dictator stashes cash, or they make key parts for the regime's military gear. Or they're just next door, offering a base for resistance groups. It varies a lot.
Let's start with that first strategy, the chipping away. The sources suggest this one, the cautious one, has some real upsides.
Like what?
Well, for one, it's generally cheaper, and importantly, because it's more about supporting internal actors, the risk of truly catastrophic outcomes, like hundreds of thousands dying because of some external workshop, it's much lower.
That makes sense. Less direct intervention, less chance of massive blowback.
Exactly. Plus, if it does work, the results tend to stick better. Nonviolent transitions historically just have a better track record of leading to actual democracy down the line.
So if you're going that route, the chipping away route, where do you even begin? It sounds like the absolute first step is always really careful homework. Analysis. Planning. Meaning you need to dig deep. Who actually keeps this person in power? Which groups are essential to them? And what motivates these key people? Is it power itself? Money? Keeping their families safe? Maybe even respect or ideology?
Okay.
Once you've got a handle on those dynamics, the aim is to sort of damage that support base, that pedestal, faster than the tyrant can fix it.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, let's break down the tactics then. Weakening the ruler first. A really vital step seems to be stopping outside help to the regime, especially military gear they can use on our own people.
Yeah, things like armored vehicles, small arms, helicopters, the kind of equipment that turns protests deadly.
And then there's stopping them from spying on and repressing people. Digital surveillance is huge here, right?
Oh, absolutely critical. And the sources bring up this, frankly, terrifying example. NSO Group's Pegasus spyware.
Developed in Israel.
Developed in democratic Israel, yeah. But reportedly used by the UAE against critics like Ahmed Mansour. And his story is just chilling.
What happened to him?
His life was systematically dismantled. Car stolen, email hacked, constantly tracked, passport confiscated, money stolen, fired from his job, even physically attacked. He said himself, you start to believe your every move is watched. Imagine living like that.
God, that's awful.
And apparently this software became like a tool of Israeli foreign policy, even used as a kind of peace offering after an assassination.
Which really raises the question, if democracies want tyrants to fall, should they be enabling this kind of thing?
Exactly. It's a tough question. The thinking is maybe without these super precise surveillance tools, repression has to be more widespread, less discriminate. And that, ironically, might increase the chance of a backlash from the population.
Okay, what about sanctions? They always seem popular with policymakers.
They are popular, yeah. Because it lets governments look like they're doing something without, putting troops on the ground or taking huge risks.
Yeah. But do they work? Do they actually change the dictator's behavior?
Well, the sources are pretty skeptical about that direct effect. It's like asking the dictator to sign their own political death warrant. They're just not going to do it because of sanctions alone.
So how do they work, if at all?
The insight seems to be they work indirectly. They disrupt the flow of cash and resources that the dictator uses to buy loyalty from key elites.
So it hits their patronage network.
Precisely. And not all regimes are equally vulnerable. These sources suggest personalist regimes, the ones built entirely around one leader, and monarchies. They're more susceptible because they rely heavily on outside money to keep the inner circle happy.
Whereas others are tougher.
Right. Military juntas, one-party states, they often have broader, more institutional bases of support. They're more resilient. And oil-rich states, petrostates, well, they can often just sell their oil elsewhere and ride out the sanctions.
So it's less like chopping down the tree.
And more like shaking it hard, hoping the support, the fruit, starts to fall off. It creates problems, even if it doesn't guarantee a collapse.
Gotcha. And you mentioned earlier how these things can connect.
Yeah, exactly. Another tactic is dropping external defense guarantees. If a friendly power suddenly says, we won't necessarily defend you anymore, it forces the dictatorship to spend more of its own money on its military.
Which could make them vulnerable.
It increases the risk of internal coups because the military gets more resources and potentially more power. Plus, it can make the regime more likely to make mistakes under pressure.
Okay, so that's weakening the ruler. What about the other side, strengthening alternatives, building up potential replacements?
Right. This could mean encouraging high-ranking officials to defect, maybe even offering incentives like bribes or asylum, or providing compromising information about the regime to potential rivals within it.
The sources mentioned Bobi Wine in Uganda here, right, as an example of bolstering an alternative figure.
Yeah, he's a fascinating case. Musician turned politician, incredibly charismatic.
Huge social media following, too.
Massive. Hundreds of thousands on Instagram, millions on Twitter, or what used to be Twitter. And that means when the regime harasses him, puts him under house arrest.
The world notices.
Instantly. BBC, CNN, major outlets pick it up. And that international spotlight, according to the sources, makes it significantly more difficult for Uganda's dictator to eliminate him, even with all the intimidation. It gives him a layer of protection.
That's interesting. So spotlight as a shield.
In a way, yes. Now, while most threats to tyrants come from other elites, we shouldn't forget the power of the masses. Popular uprisings can sometimes topple leaders very quickly.
Or at least put pressure on those elites to make a move.
Exactly. Tyrants work hard to exploit what's called the coordination problem.
That's that.
It's that feeling where individuals are unhappy. They might even know others are unhappy, but nobody wants to be the first one to stick their neck out. They feel isolated, afraid.
Makes sense. Safety in numbers, but how do you get the numbers together?
And that's where outsiders can sometimes help bridge that gap. By facilitating communication, bringing disparate opposition groups together, like the sources mention how outside NGOs were apparently key in uniting the opposition in Gambia.
And they can offer practical help, too.
Yeah, things like advice on creating viral social media content, pointing out secure communication methods.
Like which messaging apps are safe.
Right, or supporting existing civil society groups, churches, unions, even things like disability groups. Any organization that allows people to coordinate and mobilize outside of government control can become important.
Even helping political exiles matters.
It can, yeah. Keeping opposition figures active and connected, even when they're forced to flee. And underpinning all of this is the free flow of information.
The internet.
The internet. Despite every effort by tyrants to control it or use it for surveillance, it remains incredibly valuable for activists to coordinate, share information, and mobilize people when the moment is right.
So democracies can help by, what? Developing secure apps, helping people get around censorship.
That's the idea. Supporting the tools that enable that free flow of information.
Okay, so that's the slow burn, the chipping away. Now let's talk about the dynamite, the direct approach.
Yeah, this is the high risk, high reward, and potentially very high cost strategy.
The sources are really clear here. Yes, it can be fast, incredibly effective if it works, but it's also incredibly destructive. It can easily spiral into full-blown war.
And the outcomes are often not sustainable, even if you win initially. Plus, it's vastly more expensive in terms of money and, more importantly, lives.
What kind of tactics are we talking about here?
It gets pretty aggressive. Things like actively making life miserable for the regime's inner circle, encouraging sabotage, especially damaging infrastructure in, say, petrostates.
Cutting off the oil money?
Right. Arming opposition groups directly. Actively encouraging military coups, even in extreme cases, providing safe houses or support for assassination attempts. Yeah. But the sources add a huge caveat. Actions like these, they rarely stay secret for long. And there can be serious diplomatic, political, even legal consequences for the countries or groups providing that kind of support.
And then there's the ultimate direct action, military intervention, using your own forces.
Which, as the sources note, is a path few really want to take, despite some historical examples.
They mention Japan and Germany after World War II.
As successful, albeit massive and costly, examples of externally imposed regime change leading to democracy. And more recently, the regional intervention in Gambia that ousted Yahya Jammeh, that one had relatively little opposition and did lead to more freedom.
But those seem like exceptions.
Very much so. The sources state pretty bluntly that most foreign regime change operations are not like that. They tend to fail. Or they create new, sometimes worse, problems.
So if direct action is too risky or just not feasible, what's left?
Then you shift to more of a monitor and prepare stance. Basically, you watch closely and wait for inevitable windows of opportunity. Crises happen.
Wait, what kind of crises?
Could be anything. Spontaneous mass protests erupting, a faction of the military mutinying, a devastating natural disaster that weakens the state's control, or simply, the tyrant getting old or sick. Mortality catches up to everyone.
Even dictators can't stop time or earthquakes.
Exactly. The point is to be ready when those moments arrive.
Now, there's another angle here that the sources bring up, which is interesting. It's about minimizing the damage dictators can do by looking inward at ourselves.
Well, yeah, this is about tackling the enablers within liberal democracies, rolling back the influence of the suit-wearing allies, as one source puts it.
Who are they?
Accountants, bankers, lawyers, PR firms. The professionals who help autocrats launder their money, buy influence, polish their image, and convert stolen cash into political power back home and abroad.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Think about states like Qatar owning big chunks of major companies like Volkswagen, or the Saudi royal family investing heavily in tech firms. You see shady figures linked to autocracies buying European football clubs or acquiring critical infrastructure ports, telecoms companies.
So it's about cutting off their leverage points within our systems.
Precisely. Systematically reducing the ways autocrats can use our own open systems against us.
And once you address that, then what?
Then you need, as the sources say, a big, loud siren, which means having serious contingency plans ready to go.
Plans for what?
For when those warning signs flash. Knowing who the likely successors might be. Understanding the fault lines in the regime. Planning for what happens if the whole thing collapses suddenly.
This sounds like where that Cuba example fits in. Zunzunio.
Yeah, that's presented as a, let's say, creative, if controversial, example of preparing for an opening.
Remind us what that was.
It was a social network, basically a basic Twitter clone for Cuba, secretly created back in 2010 by a U.S. government contractor and USAID.
Secretly?
Totally hidden. Made to look like a regular business. They apparently used stolen Cuban phone numbers to build a user base, set up shell companies in places like the UK and the Cayman Islands, used offshore bank accounts, all to hide the U.S. government link.
And the plan was?
The idea was, if a political crisis hit Cuba, say, big protests, the U.S. could instantly message all the Zunzunio users, maybe tens of thousands of people, with anti-government messages, help them coordinate, try to amplify the unrest.
That sounds ethically questionable. Deceiving users like that.
Hugely questionable and risky. One U.S. senator apparently called the whole thing dumb, dumb, dumb. But the sources point to it as an example of trying to have a tool ready for that potential siren moment.
And that readiness is key.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because when those moments of instability hit, things can go in any direction.
Yeah.
Peaceful transition, civil war, total chaos. Having contingency plans ready, being able to act quickly and decisively is crucial.
Okay. We spent a lot of time on the how outsiders try to chip away, how they sometimes use dynamite. But this brings us to a really fundamental question.
Which is?
Just because we can potentially topple tyrants and maybe we have a better idea how, does that mean we actually should? Is it always the right call?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are really strong arguments against automatically intervening.
Such as?
Well, first, just the sheer uncertainty. Predicting what comes after a tyrant falls is incredibly difficult, maybe impossible. These are rare events. Even the experts get it wrong constantly.
Hindsight isn't 20/20.
Not even close, especially with opaque regimes. As one source puts it, what feels like perfect vision is really just a fraction of the whole image. What replaces the tyrant could easily be worse. Anarchy, civil war, a different dictator.
Then there's the cost.
Right. The financial cost, sure, but more importantly, the human cost, especially if it involves military force. That blood and treasure calculation is very real.
It feels like, based on what we've discussed, the chipping away methods should almost always be preferred, theoretically. Less costly, less risky.
Theoretically, yes.
But in the real world, do things like promoting democracy always win out? Our sources suggest that often these ideals get trumped by less abstract concerns.
Like trade deals.
Yeah.
Oil. Military bases.
Exactly. Does stability, even a repressive kind of stability, often end up being the actual priority for outside powers, even if it's just a temporary illusion?
That's a very real dynamic in foreign policy. And then you have the ethical concerns layered on top of that.
Meaning?
Well, look, most people would agree folks deserve a say in how they're governed. But do they want outsiders, however well-intentioned, choosing their leaders for them? Or removing leaders they might, for complex reasons, still support? It touches on fundamental ideas of sovereignty and self-determination.
There's that North Korea example in the sources during the famine in the 90s that really brings this ethical dilemma into sharp focus.
It's a truly harrowing case. The Kim regime was asking for international food aid.
But refusing proper monitoring.
Exactly, which created this nightmarish problem for donor countries and NGOs. If you give aid, you risk strengthening the regime. Food gets diverted to the army or elites. Plus, aid is fungible. If outsiders pay for food, the regime can use its own money for weapons or repression.
But if you don't give aid,
millions starve. It's an awful choice. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, actually pulled out because they felt too much aid was being diverted.
But ultimately, aid did flow in.
Yes, hundreds of millions of dollars worth. Because, as the sources conclude, sometimes, well, some things are just more important than toppling tyrants. Preventing mass starvation can override those political goals.
So wrapping this all up, where does this leave us? What's the takeaway?
Well, it seems despite all the powerful reasons to stay out, the sources do suggest there can be a tipping point. A point where the cost of inaction, letting genocide happen, letting a regime destabilize a whole region just becomes too high to ignore.
But even then, especially with those chipping away strategies, it requires incredible patience.
Immense patience. Yeah. And it's so hard to judge success in real time. There's that famous story, maybe misattributed, about Zhou Enlai being asked about the impact of the French Revolution.
And he said it's too early to tell.
Right. Though apparently he was actually talking about the 1968 Paris protests. But the point holds, doesn't it? The real consequences of these huge disruptions might not be clear for decades, even centuries. Look at the French Revolution itself. Democracy didn't arrive overnight. There was the terror, Napoleon. It was messy.
So no magic wand, no simple button to fix tyranny.
Seems not. It's more about constantly, patiently chipping away at the structures that support dictators, and crucially, being ready strategically, politically, operationally, when those inevitable cracks appear.
And we have to accept that even when a tyrant falls, things might get worse before they get better.
That seems to be a recurring lesson. Things can definitely go from bad to worse before it gets better. It's a tough reality to swallow.
But looking at the bigger picture, are tyrants inherently fragile?
In many ways, yes. Despite all the bluster and the apparent control, they live in constant fear. Fear of assassination, fear of coups. They're often rational, calculating actors, obsessed with survival.
And their biggest threat isn't usually the masses.
Not typically. It's the elites around them, the ministers, the generals, the men with guns, as the sources put it. They manage this threat through a mix of rewards, riches, power, and repression.
And succession is always a weak point.
Generally, yes. Non-democratic systems are notoriously bad at managing peaceful transfers of power. Though we are seeing more attempts at managed successions these days, still, the fact remains. Tyrants were once the norm, now they're the exception. And maybe, just maybe, they're right to be afraid.
So, the final thought for you, our listener, is perhaps this. The question isn't just if tyrants can be toppled. We know they can. The real questions are how, at what cost, and perhaps most importantly, what is the actual responsibility of outsiders in all this? How do we weigh that desire to help against the very real risks of uncertainty, failure, and unintended consequences? It's definitely a deep dive that leaves you with a lot to think about regarding the choices we face in a world still very much